The scissors came out at midnight. Two maids held her arms while her stepmother gathered the long copper braid in one fist. The braid Clara had brushed 100 strokes every night since she was a little girl, because her mother had taught her to. The blades closed once, twice, and as the last of it fell to the cold floor, her stepmother leaned down close to Clara's ear and whispered 5 words. Now he'll never know. Clara didn't understand what those words meant, not that night. But the man arriving in the morning, the Duke, he would ask only one question at dinner, and that one question would bring the whole house down. Clara Hartwell had learned, over the past 6 years, that the safest thing a girl in her position could do was stay invisible. She rose before the sun. She lit the fires, scrubbed the floors, carried the water. She ate in the kitchen with the servants, though this house had once been her father's house, and every stone in it knew her name. Her father, Thomas Hartwell, had been a kind man. Too kind, the servants used to say. Kind enough to marry a widow named Agatha 2 years after Clara's mother died, because he believed a growing girl needed a mother's hand. Agatha had arrived with soft smiles and a daughter of her own, Beatrice, golden-haired and pretty, 1 year older than Clara. For a while the smiles held. Then, when Clara was 14, her father's heart stopped in his sleep, and by the time the funeral flowers had wilted, the smiles were gone. "You'll earn your keep like everyone else," Agatha had said, standing in the doorway of Clara's bedroom while 2 footmen carried Clara's belongings up to the attic. "This house cannot afford idle girls." The house could afford new gowns for Beatrice every season. It could afford Agatha's parties and Agatha's carriages, but it could not, apparently, afford Clara. So Clara scrubbed and she stayed silent, and she survived. She had only one treasure left, and it could not be taken from her because she wore it every day of her life: her hair. Copper red, thick and shining, falling past her waist when she unpinned it at night. Her mother's hair, the exact hair of the beautiful woman in the portrait that still hung above the main staircase, the portrait Agatha had somehow never dared to remove. Sometimes, passing that painting with a bucket in each hand, Clara would stop for just a moment and look up. "I'm still here, Mama," she would think. "I'm still here." That was before the night of the scissors. It began with a letter. Clara was polishing the silver in the dining room when the messenger came, a rider in a fine dark coat, mud on his boots, a sealed envelope in his hand. She heard Agatha's voice in the hall, sugary and bright, and then she heard the study door close. Whatever was in that letter, it changed the house within the hour. Agatha swept through the corridors giving orders like a general. The good china was to be brought out. The guest wing aired. Fresh flowers, new candles, the French wine from the cellar. "He'll be here tomorrow by noon," Clara heard her tell the housekeeper, Mrs. Finch. "Everything must be perfect, everything." "Who, madam?" Mrs. Finch asked. Agatha's answer floated down the hallway, and even from a distance, Clara could hear the hunger in it. "The Duke of Ravenscourt." The name meant little to Clara. She knew what everyone knew, that Ravenscourt was one of the richest estates in England, and that its young duke was said to be cold as January and had never once been seen to smile. Why such a man would come here, to a faded country house with debts stacked in the study drawers, she couldn't imagine. But Beatrice could. Clara heard her that evening through the parlor door, breathless with excitement. Duke Mama, why would a duke come to us?" "Because of an old promise," Agatha said. Her voice was low, careful. "A very old promise made between his late father and," she paused, "this family, a debt of honor, and debts of honor, my darling, are paid in marriage." Beatrice squealed. Clara, standing in the hallway with the tea tray, felt the cups tremble very slightly against the saucers, though she couldn't have said why. Something in Agatha's pause, something in the words "this family," said the way a person says words they have rehearsed. She carried the tea in, eyes down, invisible as always. But as she set the tray on the table, she felt it, Agatha's gaze fixed on her, not on her face. On her hair. Clara had pinned it up under her cap, as always, but a few copper strands had slipped loose at her neck. She felt Agatha's eyes on those strands the way a rabbit feels the shadow of a hawk. "That will be all, Clara," Agatha said softly. Too softly. They came for her after midnight. Clara woke to candlelight in her little attic room and hands seizing her arms, Dora and Millie, the two housemaids who did whatever Agatha paid them extra to do. Clara opened her mouth to cry out, but there was Agatha in the doorway, calm as Sunday morning, a pair of long silver scissors gleaming in her hand. "Hold her still." "Please," Clara twisted, her heart slamming. "Please, what are you?" "There's fever in the village," Agatha said, walking closer unhurried. "Everyone knows fever hides in long hair. I'm doing you a kindness, girl." "There's no fever. Please, not my hair, asterisk, please, asterisk. It's all I have of her." For one instant, something flickered across Agatha's face. Not pity, something colder, confirmation. She gathered the long copper braid in her fist and pulled it taut. "That," she said, "is precisely the problem." The scissors closed. Once. Twice. Clara heard the sound more than she felt it, a dry, terrible whisper of blades through the hair her mother used to braid by the fire, the hair that was the last living piece of her. When it was done, Dora and Millie let go. Clara sank to the floor among the fallen coils of copper, too stunned even to weep. And that was when Agatha bent down, so close Clara could smell the lavender water on her skin, and whispered, "Now he'll never know." Then she straightened, dropped the braid into Millie's apron like a rag for the fire, and walked out. Clara sat on the cold floorboards for a long time, her shorn head bare, her hands shaking. 5 words going around and around in her mind. Now he'll never know. Who would never know? And what? Clara pressed her trembling hands against the floor. What was it that he must never find out? Downstairs, the great clock struck 1. In 11 hours, the Duke of Ravenscourt would arrive. And though Clara could not have known it then, he was coming to ask a question. One single question, a question he had waited 8 years to ask. The answer had just been swept up and thrown into the kitchen fire. The Duke's carriage appeared at the end of the drive at exactly noon. Clara watched it from an upstairs window, a dust cloth forgotten in her hand. 4 black horses, perfectly matched. A crest on the door, a silver raven on a field of deep blue. The whole household had been assembled on the front steps for an hour. Agatha in her finest plum silk, Beatrice in white muslin with her golden hair arranged in careful curls that had taken poor Dora all morning. Clara had not been assembled with them. She had been given her orders at dawn. "You will stay out of sight," Agatha had said, inspecting Clara's shorn head with open satisfaction before pulling a servant's cap down over it low to the eyebrows. "You will serve. You will not speak. If His Grace addresses you, which he will not, because men like him do not see servants, you will answer in as few words as possible and remove yourself. Is that understood?" "Yes, madam." "And Clara," Agatha had paused at the door, not turning around, "if you are thinking of telling anyone in this house who your father was, remember that the workhouse takes girls your age, and no one would come looking." So Clara stood now at the upstairs window, invisible as ordered, and watched the man step down from the carriage. Her first thought was that he was younger than she'd expected. The way people spoke of the Duke of Ravenscourt, the coldness, the silence, the fortune, she had pictured someone gray and heavy. But the man on the gravel below was perhaps 30, tall, dark-haired, dressed in black so plain it made Agatha's plum silk look like a costume. Her second thought was that everyone was right. He did not smile. Agatha curtsied deep. Beatrice curtsied deeper. The Duke bowed the exact minimum that courtesy required, and even from the upstairs window Clara could see that his eyes were already moving, past Agatha, past Beatrice, across the front of the house, the windows, the grounds. Not like a guest admiring an estate. Like a man searching for something. For half a heartbeat, his gaze swept the window where she stood. Clara stepped back so fast she nearly knocked over the washstand, her heart pounding, and then she felt foolish. He hadn't seen her, and what if he had? Men like him do not see servants. She picked up her dust cloth and went back to work. By evening, the servants' hall was thick with gossip. "Not one smile," said Dora, who had helped carry his trunks. "Not one. Thanked me, though. Dukes don't thank you usually." "He asked Mrs. Finch how long she'd served here," said the footman John. 22 years, she told him. And then he asked. John lowered his voice. He asked who else had been in service here longer than 10 years. Mrs. Finch, at the head of the table, said nothing. But Clara, eating her bread quietly at the far end, saw the old housekeeper's eyes lift, just briefly, and rest on her. "Why would he ask that?" Dora said. "Making conversation," John shrugged. "Dukes," said Mrs. Finch in a voice that closed the subject, "do not make conversation." Upstairs that night, in the finest guest room of a house that had seen better days, Julian, Duke of Ravenscourt, stood at the window with an old letter in his hand. He had read it perhaps 1,000 times. His father's handwriting, thin and slanting, from the last month of his life. "And if you ever recover what we lost, Julian, remember that we owed Thomas Hartwell more than money. When the whole county turned its back on us, Hartwell alone kept faith. I promised him our families would be joined, that my son would offer his hand to Hartwell's daughter. A promise made in the dark is still a promise. Pay it. Hartwell's daughter." Julian folded the letter away. His father had never known, could never have known, the strange, private reason his son had leapt at this particular debt of honor. There were 100 easier ways to honor a dead man's promise than to come here in person. He could have sent solicitors, arranged everything by post, the way half the marriages of England were arranged. Instead, he had come himself, because of the rain. 8 years ago. He'd been 22, penniless in everything but name, the family fortune gone to his father's failed ventures, riding a borrowed horse home from another humiliating meeting with creditors. The storm had come out of nowhere, the road had turned to river, and the horse had thrown him at the ford and bolted. He remembered lying in the mud with the rain hammering down, his ankle wrenched, and the carriages that had passed him, 2 of them, fine ones, splashing him as they went by. Nobody stops for a ruined man. He'd learned that lesson well by then. But someone had stopped. A girl, 16, 17 perhaps, jumping down from a modest gig before the driver could even protest, running to him through the downpour, helping him up out of the mud with both hands. She had asked if he could stand. She had given him her seat and walked at the wheel through the rain, and when he'd shivered, she'd taken off her own cloak, a plain gray woolen thing, and thrown it over his shoulders like it was nothing at all. He had been too soaked, too dazed, too ashamed to ask her name, and the rain had been in his eyes the whole time. If he was honest with himself, he could not even swear to her face. But 2 things he remembered, and had never once stopped remembering. The small crest painted on the door of the gig, a heron over crossed wheat sheaves. Years later, when the money was his again and he'd hired men to search, they had matched it. Hartwell. And her hair. The hood of her cloak had fallen back in the wind, and in all that gray rain, her hair had been the only color in the world. Copper red, a long braid of it, so bright it looked lit from inside. "I'll return the cloak," he had called after the gig as it pulled away. And he'd heard her laugh, young and warm, the laugh of someone who had no idea she had just done anything remarkable. "Keep it. You need it more than I do." Then the rain had swallowed her. Hartwell's daughter, his father's promise and his own 8-year search, ending, if there was any mercy in the world, at the same front door. Julian looked out at the dark garden. He had met the daughter of the house today. Golden curls, a rehearsed curtsy, a mother who watched him the way a fox watches a henhouse. Beatrice, they called her, pretty enough, charming enough. Golden. People's hair darkened with age, he told himself. Lightened sometimes. 8 years was a long time, and rain-soaked memory was a poor witness. Perhaps. But there was a portrait above the main staircase. He had passed it on the way to his room and stopped as if struck. A woman with warm, laughing eyes. And copper-red hair. Tomorrow at dinner, he decided he would ask. One simple question. Careful, quiet. He had waited 8 years, he could be patient one more day. He did not know, could not have known, that one floor above him, in a cold attic room, a girl lay awake with her hand resting on her bare, shorn scalp, wondering the same 5 words over and over into the dark. Now he'll never know. The house slept between them, keeping its secret. The dinner table had never looked so fine. Clara had spent the entire afternoon polishing silver that hadn't left its case in 6 years. Her father's silver, engraved with the Hartwell heron, though Agatha had long since stopped calling it that. The good candlesticks were lit. The French wine was breathing. Cook had made 5 courses out of a household budget that usually strained to make 2. And Clara, in her plainest black dress, and the cap pulled low over her shorn head, had been assigned to serve. She had wondered briefly why Agatha would allow her in the dining room at all. Then she'd caught her own reflection in a polished tray, hollow-eyed, cropped, shapeless in servant's black, and understood. There was nothing left to hide. The scissors had seen to that. What better proof that Clara was no one than to let the Duke look straight at her and see nothing at all? The party came in at 8. Agatha glittering, Beatrice glowing, and the Duke in his plain black, pulling out Beatrice's chair with perfect, mechanical courtesy. "Your Grace does us such honor," Agatha purred as the soup went around. "Such a long journey, and you came yourself. Most gentlemen these days settle everything through lawyers." "Some matters," the Duke said, "shouldn't be left to lawyers." His voice was quiet, even. He had a way of answering that ended sentences rather than continued them, but Agatha was undaunted. Through the soup and the fish she talked about the neighborhood, about London, about Beatrice. Mostly about Beatrice. Beatrice's music. Beatrice's French. Beatrice's watercolors, her needlework, her delicate health that was nonetheless perfectly robust for bearing here a cough, for enduring the duties of a great house. Beatrice smiled and blushed on cue. She had been rehearsed within an inch of her life, and to be fair, Clara thought as she poured the wine, she performed beautifully. The Duke ate little, spoke less, and watched everything. Clara felt his attention the way you feel whether never on her, exactly, but moving around the room. He watched Agatha talk. He watched Beatrice glance at her mother before every answer. Twice he asked Beatrice something simple and direct. Did she ride? Did she enjoy the country? And both times Agatha's voice arrived a half-second before her daughter's could. If he noticed the serving girl with the cap pulled low, he gave no sign of it. Men like him do not see servants. Good, Clara told herself, keeping her eyes on the wine, on the plates, on anything but him. Good. It happened between the roast and the sweet. Beatrice had been sent to the pianoforte. Just a little something, darling. His Grace is fond of music. And was playing a piece she had drilled all week, prettily and without a single mistake. Agatha beat time with one finger against her glass, radiant with the particular pride of a gambler watching her horse come up the final stretch. The Duke was not looking at the piano. Clara, standing at the sideboard with the decanter, followed his gaze through the open dining room doors, across the hall, up the sweep of the staircase, to the portrait. Her mother looked back down at them all from her gilt frame, young, laughing-eyed, painted the spring before Clara was born, her copper hair loose over one shoulder the way she'd always worn it at home. Clara's hands tightened on the decanter. Don't look at it, she thought, absurdly, uselessly, at a Duke she had never spoken to. Please don't look at it. Beatrice finished her piece. Agatha applauded. You see, Your Grace, didn't I tell you? Such feeling, her poor dear music master always said. Madam. The Duke's voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. It cut Agatha off like a door closing. He was still looking through the doors, up the stairs, and now he raised one hand and pointed, unhurried, precise, at the portrait. "The lady in that painting," he said. "Which of your daughters has her hair?" The room went absolutely still. The decanter nearly slipped from Clara's fingers. She caught it against the sideboard with a soft clink of crystal that sounded to her like a gunshot. No one turned. No one was looking at her. Every eye in the room was on Agatha, whose fork had stopped halfway to her plate, whose face, for one long, naked second, was the face of a woman standing on a trapdoor, hearing the bolt slide back. "Which of your daughters?" Not "who is the lady?" Not "what a charming portrait." The Duke had asked his question the way a lawyer asks a question, already knowing it mattered, watching to see what the answer would do. And in that frozen second, standing invisible by the sideboard, Clara understood three things all at once, so fast it made her dizzy. The Duke was looking for hair, copper-red hair. Her mother's hair, asterisk her hair, the hair that had been sheared off her head at midnight and burned in the kitchen fire. Agatha had known he would look for it. Now he'll never know. Clara's shorn scalp prickled under the cap. Her heart was beating so hard she was sure the whole room must hear it. "He's looking for me. Whoever this man is, whatever this is, he came here looking for me. And I'm standing 10 feet away from him and he has no idea, because the only thing he knows me by is gone." The fork completed its journey. Agatha set it down, dabbed her mouth with her napkin and smiled, and Clara had to admire, with a kind of horror, how quickly the trapdoor closed again. "Why, Your Grace," Agatha said warmly. "What a question." "Why, Your Grace, what a question." Agatha's laugh was light as spun sugar. She turned in her chair to gaze up at the portrait with an expression Clara had never once seen her wear in front of it, fondness. "That is my dear Beatrice's mother, of course. My own poor self, if you can believe it, painted the year before my darling girl was born." She pressed a hand to her breast. "I was quite the beauty then, they tell me. Time is a thief, Your Grace." Clara stopped breathing. The lie was so enormous, so calm, so smooth asterisk, that for a moment her mind simply refused it. That was her mother. Her mother's laughing eyes, her mother's spring morning, her mother's copper hair loose over one shoulder, and Agatha had just stepped inside the frame and put it on like a stolen coat. "Indeed," the Duke said, his face showed nothing. "The likeness is remarkable, and yet—" He looked at the portrait a moment longer. "The lady's hair." "Ah, the hair," Agatha sighed as if touched by the memory. "Beatrice had exactly that hair as a small child, Your Grace, exactly. Red as a new penny, didn't you, my love? Everyone remarked on it, and then, as so often happens, it turned gold as she grew. My grandmother's hair did precisely the same." She smiled at her daughter. "Though I confess I sometimes miss my little copper-headed girl." Beatrice, to her credit or her training, managed a wistful smile. "Mamma kept a lock of it, I believe." "I did, somewhere. I must find it for you, Your Grace, it would amuse you." Clara's hands were shaking. She hadn't noticed until the glasses on her tray began to sing, a thin, tiny chime of crystal against crystal, the sound of a lie being told 6 feet away from the one person alive who could bury it. "Stop," she ordered her hands. "Stop, stop." She pressed the tray against the sideboard to still it. And when she looked up, the Duke was watching her. Not the portrait, not Agatha, her. Across the length of the room, over the candles, through the ruins of the roast course, his dark eyes had found the serving girl in the low cap, and they rested on her trembling tray and then on her face with a stillness that was worse than any question. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Then a footman moved between them with the sweet course, and the Duke turned back to his hostess and said, in a tone of mild, social interest, "You keep a lock of it, you say?" "Oh, somewhere, Your Grace, somewhere." "I'd be glad to see it." He picked up his glass. "Before I leave." He said it pleasantly. He said it the way a man says asterisk lovely weather. But Clara, gathering plates with her heart in her throat, saw what it did to Agatha's smile, how it stayed perfectly in place while everything behind it scrambled. A lock of copper hair to be produced on demand. One more brick for the lie, due on delivery. He doesn't believe her, Clara thought, and the thought was so dangerous, so bright with hope, that she crushed it immediately. It didn't matter what he believed. Tomorrow or the day after, Agatha would snip a coil of copper from the braid. The braid, Clara nearly dropped the plates. The braid had gone into the kitchen fire. She had watched Millie carry it down in her apron. There was no lock of red hair anywhere in this house to give him, unless they cut it from the only red hair left under this roof. Whatever stubble remained beneath her cap. Clara walked out of the dining room with the stacked plates and made it as far as the servants' corridor before she had to lean against the wall. She was still awake at midnight when the knock came, one soft rap on her attic door. Mrs. Finch stood on the landing with a candle in one hand and a cup of warm milk in the other, which was itself extraordinary. The housekeeper had not climbed to the attics in years, her knees being what they were. "Drink this," she said, "and sit down, child." Clara sat on the edge of the bed. Mrs. Finch settled onto the room's single stool, set the candle on the floor between them, and for a long moment just looked at her, at the cropped head Clara no longer bothered to cover in her own room. 22 years I've served this house," Mrs. Finch said at last. "I carried you down to the christening. I dressed your mother for the last time, and I'd thank you not to tell a soul I said so, because your stepmother believes I've forgotten whose house this is." The old woman's voice didn't waver, but the candlelight did in her eyes. "Tonight that woman sat at your father's table, under your mother's picture, and called it her own face. And you stood there and held your tongue, because you're a clever girl and you want to live." "Mrs. Finch." "Don't," the housekeeper raised a hand. "Don't say anything you'd have to deny later. I only came to tell you one thing, and then these old knees are going back down those stairs." She leaned forward. "That man asks questions like he already owns the answers. He asked me who served here longer than 10 years. He asked John which rooms in the house are never used. And tonight after dinner he stood in front of that portrait for a quarter of an hour, alone, in the dark." Clara's hands tightened around the cup. "I don't know what he's come for," Mrs. Finch said, rising with a grimace, "and I don't know what he knows, but hear me, child. There are only 2 things left in this house that remember the truth. One is that portrait." She picked up her candle, and at the door she paused without turning around. "The other one is me." The stairs creaked and faded, and Clara was alone. She lay back on her narrow bed and stared at the dark. Down below, somewhere in the guest wing, was a man who had crossed England to ask one question about red hair. Between them stood Agatha, a burned braid, and a lock of copper that did not exist yet. "Keep your head down," said the voice of 6 years' survival. "Say nothing, want nothing." But underneath her hand, under the cold cotton of her nightcap, the shorn hair was already growing back. A 1/4 inch of stubborn copper, pushing up through everything they'd done to her. It would take years, she thought. She didn't have years. Something in this house was going to break long before that. It broke as it happened, the very next afternoon in the library, over a book of Latin. Agatha began the hunt for red hair at breakfast. Clara heard it start through the morning room door, Agatha's voice, low and razor-edged, and Millie's frightened one answering. "The braid, girl, where is it?" "You, madam, you said to burn it. I put it in the kitchen fire myself, madam. You stood right there." There was a silence that Clara, carrying linens past the door, could feel through the wood. Then Agatha's voice again, very quiet, the way she got when things went wrong and someone else was going to pay for it. "Then you will find me red hair by tomorrow evening, or you will find another situation. I don't care where it comes from. A horse's tail, for all I care, no. No, it must be fine, it must be a * child's." A pause. "The tenant cottages. The Kellers have a little girl, haven't they? Red-headed, the whole litter of them. Take a shilling and a pair of scissors and get me a lock of it. A curl. Tell them the mistress collects them. Tell them anything." Clara stood frozen in the corridor, the linens pressed against her chest. A shilling and a pair of scissors. That was all it took to build a lie for a duke. A curl clipped from a tenant's daughter, tied with ribbon, aged between the pages of a Bible and presented with a sigh. My darling Beatrice's baby hair. Who on earth would ever question it? He would, something whispered in her. He asked to see it. He asked the way men ask when they're setting a trap. She forced her feet to move before the door opened. But all that morning, scrubbing the gallery floor beneath her mother's portrait, Clara found herself doing something she had not permitted herself in 6 years. Hoping. It terrified her more than the scissors had. The library was Clara's secret church. Her father's books still lived there. Agatha had sold the atlas with the gold spine and anything else that looked expensive, but the rest she'd ignored, because books bored her and the room faced north and was cold. So it had become Clara's task to dust it, and Clara made the task last as long as she dared. She knew every shelf. The poetry her mother had loved, third case, second shelf. Her father's Latin he taught her himself, winter evenings, her small hand under his big one following the lines. Amor vincit omnia, my girl, and don't let your governess tell you it's ungrammatical. Sometimes, dusting, she would take one down and stand there and read a page, and for the length of that page the last 6 years would not exist. That afternoon, with the house upside down over dinner menus and Beatrice's fittings, Clara slipped into the library with her dusting cloth and found the doors of the third bookcase standing open. Someone had been at her father's Latin shelf. 2 volumes lay on the reading table, the Virgil and her father's old Caesar with the cracked green spine. Clara clicked her tongue at the housemaids, none of whom could read and all of whom used books as step stools, picked up the Caesar and shelved it where it had lived for 30 years, spine out, third from the left without needing to look. "Interesting," said a quiet voice behind her. Clara spun around, cloth pressed to her chest. The Duke of Ravenscourt was sitting in the window seat, mostly hidden by the curtain's edge, a book open on his knee. He'd been there the whole time, watching her. "Your Grace." She dropped a curtsy, eyes down, heart hammering. "Forgive me, I didn't know the room was occupied. I'll come back." "You shelved that without reading the spine." Careful. I dust in here, Your Grace. One learns where things belong." He rose, unhurried, and came to the table. He was very tall this close, and his eyes, which had seemed black across a candle-lit dining room, were in daylight a dark, unsettling gray. He picked up the Virgil and held it out to her. "Then, where does this one belong?" It was not a request. Clara took the book with steady hands, 6 years of practice at steady hands, and slotted it home, second shelf, beside the Georgics. "You've grouped it with the poetry," the Duke observed. "The Caesar with the histories, a dusting girl who sorts Latin by asterisk subject. The old master arranged them so, Your Grace. I only keep his order." The old master, Mr. Hartwell. His voice didn't change at all, and that was somehow the frightening thing. "Did you know him?" The question hung in the cold north light. Clara looked at the shelf, at the worn green spine her father's hands had held, and the truth rose in her throat so hard it ached. "He was my father. This was his room. That is my mother over the stairs, and the hair you're looking for grew on my head until 4 nights ago. I've been in service here since I was a girl, Your Grace," she said. "Everyone knew the master. He was kind." "Kind," the Duke repeated softly. He was watching her with that stillness again, the stillness from the dining room, and Clara realized her mistake. She had answered the question without answering it, and he collected answers like that. He glanced at her hands holding the cloth, chapped, work-worn, and then his gaze stopped. At her throat, where the thin silver chain she never removed had slipped free of her collar as she'd reached for the shelf. "That's a fine chain for a housemaid," he said. Clara's hand flew to it, too fast, far too fast, closing over the chain and whatever hung from it, sliding it back beneath the black cotton. It was my mother's, Your Grace. And your mother was. The library door banged open. There you are. Agatha stood in the doorway, and Clara watched her take in the scene in one flick of the eyes, the Duke, the maid, the distance between them, and go white around the mouth while her voice stayed honey. Your Grace, forgive the intrusion. Beatrice is asking for you in the music room. She's found the sweetest duet, Clara. The honey hardened. The silver in the dining room won't polish itself. And afterward, Cook wants you. There's been a spoon missing since yesterday, and I'm sure you'll want to help us account for it. A spoon. Missing. Clara felt the words settle over her like a net. Everyone in the room knew what it was, everyone except perhaps the Duke, and when she risked one glance at him as she curtsied her way out, she saw that he knew too. He was looking at Agatha the way he had looked at the portrait. Counting something. Madam, Clara heard him say behind her, pleasant as ever as the door closed, you never introduced me. Your maid's name is Clara, is it? She didn't hear Agatha's answer, but she heard the pause before it, and the pause was very long. Agatha struck that same night, and she struck the way she always struck, smiling. Clara was summoned to the morning room after the household had gone up. Agatha sat by the lamp with her correspondence, and she did not look up for a full minute, which was an old trick of hers, and it still worked. By the time she set down her pen, Clara's palms were damp. You've been noticed, Agatha said, no preamble. That was careless of you. Madam, I never. You never, of course you never. Agatha rose and crossed to the window, her reflection ghosting on the dark glass. It doesn't matter what you never. A man like that notices a crooked candle, and you, she turned and looked Clara over slowly from the boots to the cropped head. You are a very crooked candle indeed. So, you're going away. The floor seemed to tilt. Away, madam. To my cousin Prout in the north. She's been poorly and needs a strong pair of hands. You'll do very well there. Agatha returned to her desk and took up her pen again as though the matter were a grocery order. The carriage comes for you tomorrow night after the house is asleep. You'll tell no one, not the kitchen, not the maids, a beat, and not Mrs. Finch. If his grace should notice one servant fewer, which he will not, you left to nurse a sick aunt. Girls of your sort are always leaving to nurse sick aunts. Madam, please, Clara heard the crack in her own voice and hated it. I was born in this house. Agatha's pen stopped. No, she said quite softly without looking up. A gentleman's daughter was born in this house. I don't see one anywhere, do you? The pen resumed its scratching. Pack tonight, that will be all. There was almost nothing to pack. That was the thought that finally broke Clara, sitting on the floor of her attic room past midnight beside the small wooden trunk that held the whole of her life. 6 years in her father's house, and everything she owned went into a box a child could carry. 2 work dresses, a darned shawl, her mother's hymn book, hidden all these years under a false bottom Mrs. Finch had shown her how to make, a bundle of letters in her father's hand. She was lifting the hymn book out when her knuckles brushed wool. At the very bottom of the trunk, folded small and flat where it had lain for 8 years, was a man's riding cloak. Gray, heavy, travel-stained, water-marked along the hem where no sponging had ever quite lifted the memory of that storm out of it. Clara sat back on her heels. She had been 17, coming home from the village in the gig with old Samuel driving, the sky going green-black, and then the rain like the end of the world. And in the middle of the flooded ford, a man in the mud. Young, soaked to the bone, one leg twisted under him, and 2 fine carriages had already gone past him, past him, throwing water. She remembered being so angry about that. She remembered jumping down before Samuel could stop her. The man had been ashamed. That was what she remembered most. Not hurt, not frightened, ashamed. The way men are when the world has been kicking them a long time and a stranger arrives to witness it. He tried to refuse her seat. He tried to refuse the cloak. She'd thrown it over his shoulders anyway because he was shaking and told him to keep it. I'll return it, he had called after the gig, standing in the downpour with the gray wool around him. I'll return it, I give you my word. And she had laughed, and the rain had swallowed him, and she had never even asked his name. 2 weeks later, a parcel had come to the house, addressed only to the young lady of the Hartwell gig, the cloak, cleaned and pressed, with no letter and no sender. Her father had teased her about her mysterious night for a month. 6 weeks after that, her father was dead, and Agatha owned the world, and the cloak had gone to the bottom of the trunk with everything else that was over. Clara lifted it out now, and held it against her chest in the candlelight. Strange the things that survive. The braid was Ash. The house was Agatha's. Her name, by tomorrow night, would belong to nobody at all, a strong pair of hands in the north, no past, no portrait, no proof. And yet here was this, one gray cloak that a drowning man had promised to return, and had returned because apparently there existed, somewhere out in the world, at least one person who kept their word. She would not take it north. The thought arrived whole and certain, though she couldn't have explained it. Cousin Prute's house would swallow whatever entered it. Some things shouldn't be swallowed. Clara wrapped the cloak in brown paper, and before the candle burned out she carried it down through the sleeping house to Mrs. Finch's little parlor door, and knocked. The old housekeeper opened it in her nightcap, took one look at Clara's face, and stood aside without a word. "They're sending me away," Clara said. "Tomorrow night I'm not to tell you." Her voice held. "So I'm not telling you, I'm only leaving something in your keeping." She put the parcel in Mrs. Finch's hands. "It belonged to a traveler once," Clara said. "He'll never come for it, but if he ever should—" and there her voice finally failed just for a moment on the whole ruin of everything. "If he ever should, give it to him, and tell him the Hartwell girl said the debt was paid long ago." Mrs. Finch looked down at the parcel for a long time. When she looked up, her eyes were bright and hard. "Where are they sending you, child?" "North, a cousin, I'll write when." "Where * north?" And Clara realized with a small cold slide of fear that she didn't know. No town, no address, just a carriage coming after dark for a girl the house would deny had ever existed. Above them in the guest wing, a floorboard creaked, the sound of a man who could not sleep, walking, somewhere over their heads. The trap closed at dinner, and it closed with witnesses. Julian knew something was wrong the moment he came down and found the drawing room full. The vicar and his wife, a neighboring squire and his 2 daughters, a colonel of some retired regiment, already deep in the sherry. Agatha had assembled an audience overnight, and a hostess only gathers an audience when she means to perform something that cannot be taken back. "Your Grace," she swept toward him, radiant in wine-dark silk. "You'll forgive a little company, such friends, all * longing to meet you." He bowed to the room and calculated. He had planned to leave in 2 days. Quietly, questions unanswered, and then return with lawyers, records, the parish register, whatever it took to unearth what this house was burying, because it was burying something. The portrait with the borrowed face. The lock of red hair produced that morning, a child's curl, tied in ribbon, smelling faintly of someone else's cottage. The maid who shelved Latin, whose chain she guarded like a wound, whose name had made Agatha pause one heartbeat too long. Clara. He had asked 2 servants about her that day, as idly as he knew how. Both had glanced over their shoulders before answering, and both had said almost nothing, and the nothing was louder than speech. He needed a week. Agatha, it turned out, needed only an evening. It came at the table between courses, when the colonel, well-watered by then and clearly primed, raised his glass and boomed, "Well, Your Grace, am I permitted to say what the whole county is whispering? A certain happy understanding between 2 great families, eh? Colonel," Agatha chided, delighted, "you'll embarrass His Grace." "Embarrass? A promise between fathers is a sacred thing, madam. I say it's a sacred thing." "It is." Agatha turned to Julian, and her eyes were soft and her voice was softer, and underneath both was the click of a key turning. "Your Grace, forgive me. I had meant to wait, but since our dear Colonel has opened the subject before friends, I think perhaps the time for waiting is past." She nodded to the footman, and the footman brought a silver tray, and on the tray lay a letter. Julian knew the hand before it reached him. Thin, slanting, unmistakable, his father's. "Your late father wrote this to my late husband," Agatha said gently, "in the last year of his life. Mr. Hartwell treasured it. I have treasured it since. Read it, your grace. Read it aloud, if you will. There is nothing in it either family need blush for." He read it silently first. It was genuine. That was the horror of it. His father's voice rose off the page, the gratitude, the shame of the debt, the pledge. "My son shall offer his hand to Hartwell's daughter, and our houses shall be joined, so help me God." Hartwell's daughter. No Christian name. His father had likely never learned it, a promise sworn in the dark of ruin to a benefactor far away. "Of course," Agatha said to the table at large, dabbing her eye, "no one could hold a great man to his father's word. Times change, promises fade. If his grace felt the obligation had lapsed." She let it hang delicately in front of the vicar, the squire, the colonel, in front of a room full of the county's tongues. Then she smiled at her daughter. "But I know what my dear husband believed, and I know what Beatrice is worth." Beatrice sat with her golden head bowed, blushing on command, and Julian looked at her and understood the architecture of the whole evening. Refused now, before witnesses, with his father's oath in his hand, and he was the duke who spat on a dead man's word, his own dead father's word, to jilt an innocent girl at her own table. The story would reach London before he did. Honor the promise, and he married the wrong daughter of the right house. The wrong daughter. His certainty startled him with its violence. He had no proof, a chain, a bookshelf, a pause, nothing a court or a county would weigh for a second against a mother's sworn word and a lock of baby hair. Everyone was watching him. The colonel's glass was still raised. "Madam," Julian said slowly, "my father's word is my word." The room broke into applause. Somewhere down the table the vicar's wife was already weeping happily. The colonel was on his feet roaring a toast. Agatha pressed both hands to her heart, triumphant, humble, unbearable. And Julian, rising with his glass because there was nothing else to do, heard his own voice as if from a great distance, saying the necessary things, honored the two families, in due course, while inside him something bolted like a horse in a burning stable. In due course, he had said, not a date. He had left himself that much. A betrothal was not yet a wedding, and lawyers could be slow and registers could be found. A week. He still needed only a week. He did not get it. Clara heard the applause from the servants' stair. The sound came down through the old house like weather, a distant surf of clapping and the colonel's roar, to the duke and his bride. And she stood in the dark with a tray of clean glasses and understood that it was finished. All of it. The portrait, the question, the terrifying little hope she had been carrying around since the library like a coal in her apron. Beatrice, of course Beatrice. Where had the hope even come from? A man had looked at her twice and asked the name of a housemaid, and 6 years of good sense had nearly deserted her over it. Enough, she told herself, and was almost grateful for the carriage coming at midnight. At least she would not have to serve at the wedding. They came for her at 11:30, Dora, sent up sniffling, and behind her, keeping to the shadow of the landing, Agatha in a dressing gown with a candle. Quickly and quietly, Agatha said, out through the kitchen court. The trunk was light. That was the thing Clara chose to think about, going down the back stairs of her father's house for the last time, how light 6 years could be. Through the kitchen, past the banked fire, out the court door into a cold, clean night full of stars, where a closed carriage stood waiting with a driver she had never seen before. No lamps lit her going. No one waved. Only at the last moment, high in the house behind her, a curtain moved in Mrs. Finch's small window, and Clara lifted her hand once to the glass and the old woman behind it. "In," said the driver. She climbed in. The door shut. The carriage swung out of the court and down the long dark drive, past the gates her great-grandfather had raised, and turned north. Inside, Clara sat very straight with her hands folded on the trunk and made herself breathe and did not cry. It was done. Let it be done. The Duke would marry, the house would forget, and somewhere in the north a strong pair of hands was expected. She did not see the milestone at the crossroads, an hour on, where the north road bent away, and the carriage did not bend with it. She had never traveled this country. One dark hedgerow was any other. So she did not know, could not know, that the road they took ran east, toward the manufacturing towns, toward the gray stone institution on the hill above the river, where paupers and the nameless were received at all hours, no questions asked and none answered. Cousin Prout did not exist. And behind her in the sleeping house, Julian stood at his window watching a carriage lamp dwindle down the drive, some tradesman, some errand, nothing, and turned back to his desk, where he was writing to his lawyers by candlelight. 1 week, asterisk, he wrote, I require the parish registers of this county examined within 1 week. He had 8 years of patience left in him, he reckoned. What he did not have, though he would not learn it until the cloak was laid on his bed, was 8 days. Mrs. Finch waited 1 full day, and it was the longest day of her 22 years in service. She waited because she was old and careful, and because a housekeeper who accuses her mistress on no evidence is a madwoman, dismissed without a character by sundown. She had spent the morning after Clara's leaving making one quiet inquiry, a word with a stable lad from the village, who had watered the strange carriage's horses at the crossroads inn. North, was it, she'd asked, easy as gossip, the Prout place? North, the boy had scratched his head. That rig took the east road, missus. Heard the driver say it himself, the hill, Weatherby Hill. And then seeing her face, Missus, you've gone a queer color, missus. Weatherby Hill. Every servant in 3 counties knew what stood on Weatherby Hill. You threatened lazy scullery girls with it. Mind your work or you'll finish on the hill. The workhouse. So that evening, while the family lingered over the betrothal toasts below, Mrs. Finch climbed the stairs to the guest wing on her ruined knees, carrying a parcel wrapped in brown paper, and did the single most dangerous thing of her long, careful life. She laid it on the Duke of Ravenscourt's bed, unwrapped, and she stood beside it and waited to be caught. Julian came up a little before 11, still in the black evening clothes that had felt all day like morning dress. He saw the old housekeeper standing rigid by his bed, opened his mouth, and then he saw what lay on the coverlet. For a moment he did not move at all. Gray wool, heavy riding cloth, the collar he had turned up against that murdering rain, the shoulder seam his own tailor had let out the year before everything was lost, and there, along the hem, the water stain that no sponging had ever lifted, the exact tide mark of the worst and best day of his life. He had wondered for 8 years why the parcel he'd sent back had never been acknowledged. He had wondered if it ever arrived. It had arrived. He crossed the room slowly and put his hand on it, the way a man touches something he has decided must be a dream. Where, he said, and his voice came out wrong and he started again. Where did this come from? A girl left it in my keeping, Your Grace. Mrs. Finch's voice was steady. Her hands, folded at her waist, were not. 2 nights ago, with a message should its owner ever call for it. She said, and here the old woman's chin came up, and she delivered it word for word, the way she had been repeating it to herself for 2 days. She said to tell him the Hartwell girl said the debt was paid long ago. The room was so quiet Julian could hear the candles burn. The Hartwell girl, he repeated. Yes, Your Grace. Mrs. Finch. He turned to face her, and whatever was in his face made the old woman brace herself against the bedpost. I am going to ask you some questions now, and I ask you to consider before you answer that I have spent 8 years and a fortune asking them of the wrong people. Who is the woman in the portrait above the stairs? And Mrs. Finch, 22 years careful, 22 years silent, found that the truth, once started, came out of her like water through a burst dam. Margaret Hartwell, Your Grace, the first Mrs. Hartwell. Dead these 13 years, God rest her, and the loveliest head of red hair in the county, and that woman downstairs sat at table and wore her face like a stolen glove, and I stood by the sideboard and let her. Her voice cracked and steadied. The portrait's daughter is not Miss Beatrice, Your Grace. Miss Beatrice came into this house at 11 years old with her mother's hair as gold as it is tonight, and I unpacked her trunks myself. Then Hartwell's daughter is Clara Margaret Hartwell, christened in the parish church, and I carried her down to the font. Your Grace, she was born in the room across this landing. The old woman's eyes were streaming now, and she let them. 6 years that woman has kept her as a scullery drudge in her own father's house, and the child bore all of it. And then 4 nights before Your Grace's coming, Madam went up to the attics at midnight with a pair of scissors and her hair, Julian said. He had gone very still. The night before I arrived, they cut off her hair. To the scalp, Your Grace. Now he'll never know. He hadn't heard the words, no one had told him the words, and yet the whole shape of it stood suddenly before him, complete and monstrous. The shorn head under the low cap, the trembling tray, the chain snatched out of sight, the Latin shelved by heart in her father's library, the girl who had stood 10 feet from him at dinner while he asked a room full of liars for the color of her hair. She had been there. She had been asterisk there, holding the decanter, invisible in servant's black, the girl from the rain, the girl from 8 years of searching, and he had looked straight through her exactly as her stepmother had known he would, because the only thing he trusted himself to know her by had been burned in the kitchen grate. He had sat at that table hunting a braid of copper hair, and all the while the debt of honor, the promise, the search, every road of his life, had ended in a girl scrubbing the floor beneath her own mother's portrait. "Where is she?" he said. Mrs. Finch's face crumpled. "Gone, Your Grace. 2 nights past the same night as the toasts. Madam put her in a hired carriage after midnight for a sick cousin in the north," she said. "Only there is no cousin, Your Grace, and the carriage never went north." The old woman's hands twisted together. "It took the east road, to Weatherby Hill, to the asterisk workhouse asterisk, Your Grace, and I let her go. I stood at my window and watched the lamps go down the drive, and I let her go." But she was talking to an open door. Julian came down the great staircase 2 at a time, past the portrait, into the drawing room where the family and the last lingering guests sat over cards and cordials. Agatha presiding, Beatrice at the piano, the colonel asleep in a wing chair. He stopped in the middle of the carpet, and something in the sound of his arrival stopped everything else. The cards, the music, the colonel's snore. Agatha rose, smiling. "Your Grace, we'd nearly given you up. Will you take a hand of? Where is Clara Hartwell?" The question landed in the room like a dropped chandelier. He asked it the way he had asked the first one, quietly, precisely, already knowing it mattered. But this time he was not watching to see what the answer would do. This time he was watching a woman's face come apart. It went in stages, and every guest in the room saw the stages happen. The smile held. The eyes did not. Clara, a housemaid's name, nothing deniable, but he had not said Clara. He had said Clara Hartwell asterisk, and he had said it in the drawing room of Hartwell House with the vicar's wife sitting bolt upright on the sofa, and there was no version of the next sentence that did not end everything. Your Grace, I don't. We have no one of that." "Madam," Julian's voice never rose. That was, the vicar's wife would say afterward, the terrifying thing, it never rose at all. "You are about to tell me a lie, and I advise you with my whole heart against it. Your parish register is being copied for my lawyers as we speak. Your housekeeper has found her tongue. And the lock of hair in my breast pocket belongs to a tenant's child called Keller. The ribbon still smells of her mother's tallow." He took 1 step closer. "So we will try it once more, and you may consider, before you answer, that the girl you put in a carriage 2 nights ago is the daughter my father's letter binds me to. Where is she?" In the silence, someone's cordial glass tipped over and rolled, unregarded, across the card table. It was Beatrice who answered. She had risen from the piano, white as her muslin, one hand pressed flat against her ribs, and when she spoke her voice was small and clear, and it broke her mother's power in the room forever. "Weatherby Hill," said Beatrice. "Mama had them take her to Weatherby Hill. I heard her give the direction." Her mouth trembled and firmed. "I didn't know until it was done. I swear before God I didn't know, but I know it now, and I won't wear a wedding got this way. Not for a duchy, not for anything." "Beatrice," Agatha's voice was a whip crack, but it cracked on air. Julian was already gone. They heard him in the hall and then in the court, his voice carrying back through the open door into the ruined drawing room. The fastest horse in that stable now, saddle nothing else. And then hooves on gravel, going away east into the dark, at a pace no carriage lamp could follow. On the wall above the staircase, serene in the candlelight, Margaret Hartwell watched them all and laughed her painted laugh. Julian rode through the night the way he had done everything for 8 years, as if the thing he was chasing might vanish if he slowed. The east road was black and rutted, the moon in and out of racing cloud, and twice the horse nearly went down in the dark. He did not slow. Somewhere behind him lay a drawing room full of wreckage, a betrothal dead on the carpet, a colonel spluttering awake into scandal, and none of it weighed as much as a feather against the one thought hammering in him with the hoofbeats. 2 nights. She has been in that place 2 nights. He knew what workhouses were. He had toured one once, as a young lord being shown the improving institutions of the district, the grey wards, the picked oakum, the smell of lye and turned soup, the faces that had stopped expecting anything. He had gone home afterward and been unable to eat his dinner, and that had been as a ** visitor*. The girl from the rain had given a drowning stranger her cloak off her own shoulders, and the world, in its wisdom, had answered her with 6 years of servitude, a pair of scissors, and Weatherby Hill. "Not 3 nights," he said aloud to the dark, to the road, to God if he was listening. "She does not spend a 3rd night in that place." Dawn was a grey line behind the chimneys of the manufacturing towns when he clattered up the long hill above the river, and the institution rose out of the morning mist exactly as he remembered its kind. A great blind barracks of soot-dark stone, iron gates, and over the gates, in letters that some committee had no doubt found improving, Labor OMNIAVINCIT. Work conquers all. Julian looked at the motto with 8 years of Latin shelving fury in him and hauled the bell pull hard enough to wake the dead. The porter who came was inclined to be difficult. It was not visiting day. It was not visiting *hours. The master was at his breakfast. And then he got the gate lamp properly on the caller's face and clothes, and heard the word *Ravenscourt*, and became, in the space of 3 seconds, the most obliging man in the north of England. The master of the workhouse received his grace in a cold parlor smelling of ink and cabbage, and confirmed, ledger open, that yes, 2 nights ago, a young woman brought in by private carriage which was irregular, but the fees had been paid for a full quarter in advance, which was more irregular still. "Paid," Julian said. "Paid by whom?" "The party did not leave a name, your grace." The master ran his finger down the column. "The young woman was entered as," he squinted, "Clara, no surname, no family. That is what the accompanying letter instructed, your grace. No surname, no family, no correspondence to be forwarded." He looked up uneasy, beginning to understand that something was very wrong with his tidy ledger. "It is not unusual, your grace. Folk have their reasons for." "Take me to her." "Your grace, the women's ward is not." Julian put both hands flat on the ledger and leaned down, and whatever the master saw in his face closed the argument. "She has a surname," Julian said quietly. "She has a family, and you are going to take me to her now. They found her in the yard." The women's yard was a square of beaten earth between high walls, where 24 gray-uniformed figures took their morning half-hour of air, walking the perimeter in 2s and 3s with their heads down against the wind. The master began scanning the line, muttering the new intake, but Julian had already stopped looking anywhere else. She stood apart at the far wall, where a stunted elder tree had somehow argued its way up through the packed ground. Gray dress, gray apron, a cropped head bare to the cold. They had taken even the servant's cap. She was looking up through the black branches at the moving sky, quite still, and Julian knew her instantly and absolutely, and understood in the same heartbeat that he had been a fool for 8 years. He had searched for hair, hired men, matched crests, memorized a color, and the truth was that he could have passed 100 copper braids in the street without turning because it had never been the hair. It was this, the particular way she stood inside catastrophe, upright, attending to the sky, the exact stillness of the girl who had stepped down into the flood while 2 fine carriages went by, as if the rain were simply a thing the world was doing and she another. He crossed the yard. The gray lines of women stopped and stared. The master hurried after him, bleating something about procedure. Julian heard none of it. She turned at the sound of his boots and went white, and dropped a curtsy that 6 years had made reflexive, her eyes down, her whole body braced. Even here, he thought, and it nearly undid him. "Your Grace," her voice was low and steady, If Madam has sent you to recover the household's property, I took nothing. They may search the trunk. I took nothing that was not." "You took nothing," Julian agreed. "That was not yours. That has been the whole trouble." He unfastened his own traveling cloak and then didn't remove it, because his hands had gone strangely unreliable, and because there was an order to this that 8 years had earned. From under his arm he took the brown paper parcel he had carried through the night inside his coat, and unwrapped it, and shook out 8 years and 1 thunderstorm's worth of gray wool. Clara's eyes came up. She looked at the cloak, at the water-stained hem, at his face, really at his face, for the first time, the way you look at something you are trying to see through rain, and one hand rose slowly and pressed against her mouth. "I told you," Julian said, "that I'd return it." The wind moved in the elder tree. Somewhere behind them, the master was still talking. Neither of them would ever be able to say about what. "You," Clara's voice came out a thread. "The ford, the man at the ford, that was," she shook her head once as if the morning had come loose from its hinges. "You couldn't be. I gave that cloak to a poor man." "You did." He stepped closer and set it around her shoulders over the gray uniform, covering it, and fastened the clasp at her throat with great care, as if it were an order of knighthood. The poorest man in 3 counties that day. He'd lost his fortune, his father was dying, and 2 carriages had just shown him precisely what the world thought he was worth. And then a girl came down into the flood and gave him her cloak and her seat and laughed like it was nothing. His voice roughened. "It was not nothing. I have been looking for you for 8 years, Clara Hartwell. My father sent me to this county to honor a promise. I came to find the girl in the rain. I did not know until last night that they were the same errand." "They told you," her chin lifted. Even now, even here, she would have things accurate. "Madam told you Beatrice." "Madam," Julian said, "told me a great many things. Your housekeeper told me the truth. Your stepsister told me the road. And your stepmother is at this moment learning what the county thinks of a woman who wears a dead lady's portrait as her own face. The vicar's wife was in the room, and I am given to understand that news travels." "Beatrice told you. Of everything, it was this that broke her voice." "Beatrice refused a duchy in front of witnesses rather than profit from what was done to you. There may be hope for her yet." He looked down at her, at the shorn copper stubble bright even in this gray yard, at the chain glinting at her collar, at the steady eyes that had watched him from behind a decanter while he interrogated a room of liars. And he did the thing he had not planned and could no more have stopped than the rain. The Duke of Ravenscourt, in the mud of a workhouse yard, before the assembled paupers of Weatherby Hill and its gaping master, went down on one knee. "They believed I would know you by your hair," he said. "They cut it off and hid you in plain sight and very nearly won because I was fool enough to be looking for a braid. But I am not asking the girl with the copper hair." He took her chapped, work-worn hand in both of his. "I am asking the girl who stopped. Clara Hartwell, daughter of the kindest man my father ever knew, will you come home? First to your own house, to stand under your mother's portrait and hear your name said properly in it. And then, if a man who took 8 years to keep one promise can be trusted with a greater one, will you be my wife?" The yard held its breath. The gray lines of women had given up all pretense of walking. The wind turned the pages of the master's forgotten ledger. And Clara, who had not wept at the scissors, nor at the drawing-room applause, nor in the carriage going east in the dark, felt her face crumple at last, and laughed at the same time, the same laugh he had carried out of the storm, young and warm and astonished. "You kept it all this time," she said. "The cloak, you kept it." "I keep things," said Julian, "that are given in kindness. It is my one great talent. Is that a yes?" "It's a yes," said Clara Hartwell, and in front of all Weatherby Hill, the girl in the pauper's gray pulled the Duke of Ravenscourt up out of the mud by both hands. It was, the women of the yard agreed ever after, only fair. By all accounts, he had done the same for her. 1 year later, the story of what happened at Hartwell House traveled, as Julian had predicted, faster than any carriage. By the end of that first week, there was not a parlor in the county that had not heard it. How the Duke of Ravenscourt had ridden out of a betrothal dinner into the night, and returned 2 days later with a shorn-headed girl in a pauper's gray dress wrapped in his own traveling cloak, and how he had walked her up the front steps of Hartwell House past the assembled, silent servants, and stopped her in the great hall beneath the portrait of a copper-haired woman. Mrs. Finch was there. Mrs. Finch told it ever after, and never once got through the telling with dry eyes. He stood her under her mother's picture, the old housekeeper would say, and he turned to the whole hall every servant in the house, for he'd rung the bell himself and summoned us all like it was Christmas morning, and he said, "This is Miss Clara Hartwell, daughter of Thomas and Margaret Hartwell, and you are standing in her father's house. I am given to understand some of you have forgotten it. You will not forget it again." And then, said Mrs. Finch, the strangest and finest thing had happened. Old John the footman, 30 years in service, a man no one had ever seen hurry, had stepped out of the line, and bowed to the girl in the gray dress, the full bow, the one reserved for the master's family. And one by one, down the whole line, cooks and grooms and housemaids, the servants of Hartwell House had followed, some of them weeping openly, Dora loudest of all, while Clara stood beneath the portrait with her cropped head high and tears running freely down her face, and let them. 6 years of invisibility ended in a single morning. Agatha was not there to see it. Agatha, by then, was already discovering the precise dimensions of what she had lost. It would have been simple and satisfying to say she was dragged off by constables. The truth was quieter and, in its way, far more terrible. There was talk of the law. The lawyers Julian had summoned found much to interest them in 6 years of Hartwell accounts, in a father's will that had provided for his daughter's keeping and education, in moneys that had gone instead to plum silk and Beatrice's seasons. But it was Clara, in the end, who stopped it. "I won't begin my life with a trial," she told Julian that first week, in her father's library with the winter sun on the Latin shelves. "I've spent 6 years in rooms with that woman. I don't intend to spend another year in courtrooms with her. Let her go." "Let her go where?" Julian had asked with some feeling. "Anywhere," said Clara, "that is not here." So there was no trial. There did not need to be. The county tried Agatha instead, in the courtroom it reserved for such matters, the drawing rooms, the church pews, the market day conversations, and the county's verdict was without appeal. The vicar's wife had been asterisk in the room. She had seen the letter, the lock of hair, the face coming apart in stages. She had heard a duke say the words parish register in a voice that never rose. Within a month, there was not a door in 3 counties that opened to Agatha's knock. Invitations ceased as if by frost. Merchants discovered, regretfully, that her credit required review. The great performance of her life, the grieving widow, the devoted mother, the portrait's borrowed face, had failed on opening night before the only audience that mattered, and there is no second season for a woman found out. She left before spring in a hired carriage for a distant seaside town where nobody knew her, the same manner of unmarked leaving. Mrs. Finch observed with grim satisfaction that she had once arranged for someone else. It was said she told her new neighbors she was the widow of a gentleman, cruelly used by grand relations. It was said she took in a lodger. It was said many things. Hartwell House stopped listening. She wrote twice to Beatrice. The first letter demanded. The second pleaded. Beatrice answered the second one only, with a banker's draft, modest, regular, enough to keep her mother respectably and no more, and a single line that Clara had helped her compose, because Beatrice had sat over the writing desk for an hour, weeping, unable to find words that were neither cruel nor false. "You will want for nothing necessary, Mamma. You will ask me for nothing more." For that was the strangest fruit of that whole strange year, Beatrice. She had tried to leave, too, in those first raw days, had come down with her trunks packed, white-faced, to where Clara was overseeing the opening of the shuttered east rooms, and said stiffly that she would go to an aunt in Bath, that she understood perfectly well she could not stay, that she asked only a day's grace to arrange the journey. Clara had looked at her for a long moment, at the golden hair, the fine gloves, the trembling mouth, at 6 years of small cruelties and averted eyes, and at one moment, one single moment in a drawing-room full of witnesses, when this pampered, frightened girl had stood up at a piano and thrown away a duchy with 4 words. I heard her give the direction. "You knew nothing about the workhouse," Clara said. "Until it was done, I believed that, and when it mattered, when it cost you everything to speak, you spoke." She turned back to the shutters and the light came into the east rooms for the first time in 6 years. "Unpack your trunks, Beatrice. One of us being sent away in disgrace is enough for this house. Besides," and here Mrs. Finch swore there had been the ghost of a smile, "I shall need a bridesmaid." Beatrice had burst into tears on the spot and been perfectly useless for the rest of the day, and had never once, from that hour, been anything less than fiercely, penitently loyal. It was Beatrice who sat with Clara through the fittings and the lawyers. Beatrice who learned, clumsily, earnestly, pricking her fingers, to do useful things with her hands. Beatrice who, when a visiting marchioness made a delicate, poisonous inquiry about the future duchess's unusual history, set down her teacup, and replied that her stepsister had spent 6 years learning every corner of the estate she would now command, and could the marchioness's daughters say as much of their accomplishments? They could not. The marchioness did not call again. Nobody minded. The hair grew back slowly, the way honest things do. Through that first winter it was a bright copper crop, close as a boy's, and Clara wore it uncovered around the house in a kind of quiet defiance that made the maids grin and Mrs. Finch's chin quiver. By spring it curled at her ears. By high summer it touched her collar, and Julian, who rode over from Ravenscourt so often that his steward learned to send documents to Hartwell House directly, developed a habit of arriving, glancing at it with elaborate unconcern, and remarking that it wanted at least another 8 years to reach a proper length, and that fortunately he had experience of waiting. They did not marry quickly. That surprised the county, which had settled in for a scandalously prompt wedding. It did not surprise anyone who knew them. There was an estate to untangle her father's affairs, 6 years knotted and bled by Agatha's stewardship, restored account by account until Hartwell land was sound again. There were tenants to visit. The Keller family received, to their bewilderment, a new roof, a milk cow, and the private, laughing thanks of a duke for the loan of 1 red curl. There was a girl who had spent 6 years being no one, learning, carefully, with occasional door-slamming setbacks, how to be someone again, how to give an order to servants who had lately been her equals, how to sit at the head of a table she had lately served, how to walk past her mother's portrait as a daughter of the house and not a ghost in it. And there was, above all, the long, unhurried joy of 2 people who had each spent 8 years believing the other half imagined, discovering they were real. They told each other everything that year in the library with the north light failing. He told her about the ruin, the true depth of it, which he had told no one, the creditors. his father's last bedridden months, the letter with its promise sworn in the dark. She told him about the 6 years, not all at once, and not easily, and there were evenings when he came away from those tellings and stood a long time at the window mastering himself, because the things done casually to her had a way of undoing him completely. He told her about the search, the hired agents, the false trails, the red-headed strangers he had crossed streets to see, feeling every time like a madman. She laughed until she cried at the crest, that he had found her by a heron and wheat sheaves painted on a gig, and then cried in earnest, because the gig had been sold in her first year of servitude, and she had watched it go down the drive. "Everything they sold," Julian said quietly that evening, "we will find. What can't be found we'll forgive. But nothing more gets taken from you, Clara. That is the whole of my policy. It is not sophisticated, but I mean to be consistent." He was consistent. When she finally showed him what hung on the thin silver chain, what she had guarded from his eyes in the library a lifetime ago, it was her mother's wedding ring, hidden 6 years against Agatha's inventories. Julian looked at it a long time. Then he asked, in a voice not quite his own, whether she would consider being married with it. And Clara, who had promised herself she was done with weeping that year, discovered she was not. They were married in the parish church on a morning in late September, 1 year almost to the week from the night of the scissors. The county came, all of it, gawkers and grandees and the vicar's wife in the front pew wearing the expression of a woman who had been asterisk in the room and would preside over this story's ending as its rightful custodian. The tenants came, scrubbed and beaming, the Keller children in a row like copper coins. The servants of Hartwell House came, every one, by the express instruction of the bride, who had ruled that a house that once forgot her would remember this together. Dora sobbed from the opening hymn and had to be propped up by John. Beatrice stood up as bridesmaid, golden and grave, and held the bride's flowers, and only those closest saw that her hands shook with the honor of it. Mrs. Finch did not sit with the servants. Mrs. Finch, by ducal insistence, sat in the family pew bolt upright in new black silk with jet buttons. 22 years of careful silence ended, the whole tale hers now to keep and tell, and when Clara passed her coming up the aisle, the bride stepped out of every rule of procession, bent, and kissed the old woman's cheek. The congregation gave up all pretense of composure. The vicar himself required a moment. Clara wore white, and her mother's ring went onto her hand where it had begun, and her hair, 1 year grown, copper bright, too short still for the towering arrangements of fashion, was dressed simply, close to her head, woven through with small white flowers. Every soul in the church knew why it was short. She wore it like a coronet. And when the vicar asked who gave this woman to be married, there was a small silence, for her father was 13 years in the churchyard outside, and everyone felt it, until old John the footman, primed and rehearsed and shaking like a leaf, stepped forward in his best coat and said, in a voice that carried to the bell tower, "Her father's house does." Julian's composure, which had survived ruin, 8 years, and Agatha, very nearly did not survive that. The wedding breakfast was held at Hartwell House, and it was during the toasts that the guests noticed what had been done to the great staircase. The portrait of Margaret Hartwell hung where it had always hung, laughing-eyed, copper hair loose over one shoulder, but it no longer hung alone. Beside it, in a matching gilt frame, newly finished, the paint scarcely dry, the painter having been sworn to secrecy and paid for haste, hung a second portrait. A young woman with short, bright, copper hair and steady eyes, painted standing in a library, one hand resting on a shelf of Latin, a thin silver chain at her throat. Mother and daughter, side by side over the hall of their own house, where every guest and every servant and every year to come would pass beneath them. Below the second frame, on a small brass plate, at the express and non-negotiable instruction of the Duke, ran a single engraved line, and guests who bent to read it, expecting a name and a date, found instead 5 words that meant nothing to most of the county and everything to the 2 people who mattered. She stopped in the rain. They left for Ravenscourt in the late afternoon, in the good carriage with the silver raven on the door, through lanes gone gold with turning leaves. Half the parish walked them to the crossroads. The Keller children ran alongside throwing late flowers until their legs gave out. And it was there, a mile past the crossroads, with Hartwell chimneys sinking behind the hills and Ravenscourt still far ahead, that the weather, which had held bright all that perfect day, finally turned. The sky went pewter over the fields. The first drops hit the carriage roof, fat and deliberate, and then the whole sweet gray curtain of an autumn rain came down across the world. Clara laughed out loud. "Of course," she said, "of course it rains." "I ordered it," said Julian gravely. "Weeks ago. It was the only detail Beatrice wasn't managing." He reached beneath the carriage seat and drew out something he had placed there that morning with his own hands, telling no one folded gray wool, heavy, travel-stained, a watermark along the hem that no sponging would ever lift, and that neither of them would ever permit to be lifted. The cloak, cleaned, kept, carried through ruin and fortune and 8 years of searching, and now, finally, exactly where it belonged. He shook it out and laid it around his wife's shoulders, over the white wedding dress, and fastened the clasp at her throat with the same absurd care as in the workhouse yard. And Clara put her hand flat against the old wool over her heart, and looked at him, and neither of them said anything at all for a mile or more, because there are moments that words only spend, and they had both learned expensively to save. The rain drummed on the roof. The lamps of Ravenscourt came up golden through the gray, far down the valley, like a house that had been waiting a long time. "You realize," Clara said at last against his shoulder, "that you have given it back to me now, the cloak, after all that, 8 years of keeping it, and you've simply handed it over." "I have," Julian agreed. "It was meant to be yours. I told you to keep it." "And I told you asterisk," said the Duke of Ravenscourt, closing his hand around his wife's, around the chapped, work-worn, beloved hand with her mother's ring on it, "that I would return it. A promise made in the dark is still a promise." He kissed her hair, copper-bright and 1 year grown, as the rain carried them home. "Besides, it was never really the cloak I was keeping." Outside, the storm washed the world clean. Inside, under the gray wool, the girl who stopped and the man who searched rode on together toward the lit windows. For some things, once given in kindness, always find their way home. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.